liked. If the moon was bright, you might go on playing after it got dark. What would you do in the winter? Winter was the time for stories. In the evening, your family would gather around the storyteller. Perhaps he would tell you the story of the child who turned into an owl. Perhaps it would be a story about Hopi history. If storyteller was never allowed to change anything in the story, the Hopi believed that all stories had to be told just exactly the way they had been told for hundreds of years. There was no farm work to do, so the men and boys had plenty of time to spend in their kiva. They would spin cotton, weave, sew clothes, and make moccasins and Conchita dolls. One of their jobs during the winter was to help guard the corn from the mice. Otherwise, there might not be anything left for your family to eat. And sometimes you'd help take the dry corn cobs off the shelves and put them out on the roof to sunbathe. That was how the Hopi got rid of some of the corn-eating insects. How would you get the latest news? Each village had a town crier. It was his job to shout out the latest news. You would hear him in the early morning and during supper time, when everyone was sure to be at home. Halaksakiai, he would cry from the highest rooftop. Listen, this is how it is. First he would say a prayer. Then he would bring the news. He would tell you that everyone was invited to a breakfast celebrating somebody's new baby, or he might welcome visitors from another village. If you had some extra peaky bread or meat that you wanted to trade, the crier would announce it, and when the pools that held the spring water got filled up with mud and it was time for the village to clean them out, the crier would let you know that too. Sometimes, though, he wouldn't call out any news. He would just sing an ancient Hopi song while everyone sat and listened. Did Hopi parents ever get divorced? Yes. Hopi parents sometimes got divorced. If a woman didn't want to be married anymore, she would put her husband's belongings outside the house. That meant they were divorced. If a man didn't want to be married anymore, he would move out of the house. That also meant they were divorced. If your parents got divorced, you would stay with your mother. You wouldn't lose your home, because a Hopi house always belonged to the woman who lived in it. Your father would go back home to live in his mother's house and help her farm her land, but he would not be too far away. Everyone living in your household, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins, would help out. Even your mother's fields would be planted and harvested, because your uncles and other members of your family's clan would take over your father's work. That way, you and your mother and sisters and brothers would be able to have food to eat, and you'd still have a household of caring relatives. Would you go on an eagle gathering trip? If you were a boy, you might be chosen to go on an eagle gathering trip. A village clan had its own eagle grounds. In the late spring, when the hatchling eagles were still too young to fly, your group would search the cliffs. The Hopi believed that if your prayers had been answered, you would find a nest with a young eagle in it. Then you would be lowered by a rope over the rim of the cliff. Sometimes the cliffs were hundreds of feet high. When you reached the nest below, you would tie a rope around the struggling eagle's foot. After you were both pulled back up safely, the eagle would be taken back to your village. If it had been a good eagle gathering year, there might already be other eagles perched on the roof high above the village. What was the eagle important to the Hopi? The Hopi believed that everyone in nature had a spirit. The spirit of the eagle was especially important because it was a messenger to the gods. A young eagle that had never hunted was pure, they thought, so it always tells the truth, and its strong eyes made it a good observer. The Hopi wanted the eagle to sit high on a roof so that it would watch everyone in the village. They treated the captured eagle with great respect. They named it in a special naming ceremony. They said prayers and gave it special food and toys. The Hopi wanted the eagle to see that they had lived good lives and had performed all their religious duties. Then later, when the eagle died, its spirits would tell the gods. The gods would bring the rain, and the Hopi would stay strong. Were also very important to the Hopi because of its feathers were used to make pahos, or prayer feathers. The feathers were tied to painted and carved sticks with cotton yarn. The Hopi used the pahos for many of their prayers they said every day. Pahos are still used today, just as they were a long time ago. Where did the Hopi get their salt? Once a year, a small group of men made a long, dangerous journey. First, they traveled for days across the desert until they reached the Grand Canyon. Then they climbed down to the steep cliffs to the canyon floor. It was here, at a sacred place, that they gathered their salt. Spanish explorers called crossing this desert the journey of death. So how did the Hopi, who didn't even have horses, What happened when the Hopi and Spanish first met? The Spanish came to Arizona looking for gold, but their soldiers found no gold. All they found were Indian villages. In 1540, Pedro de Tobar and his soldiers reached the land of the Hopi. It was the first time the Hopi had ever seen white men or horses. They made a line of sacred cornmeal in the sand, telling the intruders not to cross. But the Spanish attacked. The Hopi were no match for soldiers with guns, metal armor, and frightening horses, so the Hopi brought gifts to show that they wanted to live in peace. Tobar accepted the offering of corn, clothes, skins, and piñon nuts, and because the Hopi had no gold, he and his soldiers left. How did the Spanish treat the Indians? Although the Indians had no gold, the Spanish soon decided to take something else, their land. The Spanish said that all Indian lands now belonged to Spain. The Spanish treated the Pueblo Indians terribly, especially those living along the Rio Grande River. They stole their food and blankets and killed anyone who resisted. Many Indians were forced to work as slaves. Others died from smallpox and other new diseases brought by the Spanish. The Hopi, however, were saved by the desert. The land was so poor that not even the Spanish wanted to settle there. So as long as the Spanish wanted only land, the Hopi were safe. But in 1629, the Spanish priests arrived. They believed it was better for the Hopi to give up their religion and become Catholic. The priests sometimes used cruel methods. They punished those caught practicing the Hopi religion. Some Hopi were whipped or tortured. Some were even killed. Still, the Spanish priests could not make the Hopi give up their ancient religion. Only a few of the Indians converted to Catholicism. The rest practiced their religion in secret. Did the Hopi ever fight the Spanish? Yes. In 1680, the Hopi decided it was time to fight. Led by a Tiwa chief named Hopi, the Hopi joined with all the other Pueblo Indians and attacked the Spanish. They drove the Spanish out of their villages, destroyed the mission churches, and killed many of the priests. Thousands of Pueblo warriors fought the Spanish soldiers and won. The Spanish were forced to flee in disgrace. But the Hopi were afraid that the Spanish soldiers might one day return and punish them, so they did two things. First, they invited other Indians fleeing the Spanish to come live with them. That way, there would be more warriors to help them fight. The Hopi also moved their villages up to the top of the mesas, where it was harder for the Spanish to attack them. The plan worked. Spanish attacks failed, and the Hopi were left alone. Did other Indian tribes attack the Hopi? Yes. Even though the Hopi tried to live in peace with other tribes, they did get attacked by other Indians. Sometimes Apache, Ute, and Navajo bands on horseback raided Hopi villages and stole their corn. Sometimes they captured Hopi women and children and sold them as slaves to the Spanish and the Mexicans. If you were sold as a slave, you might never see your home again. By 1850, Navajo raids were so bad that a group of Hopi leaders traveled to Santa Fe to ask the United States military for help. But the raids, which also attacked white settlers, continued. Not until 1863, when American forces, led by the famous mountain man Kit Carson, defeated the Navajo, did most of the raids on the Hopi villages finally end. Did the Americans treat the Hopi better? When the Americans won the Mexican-American War in 1848, the land of the Hopi became part of the United States. At first, the Americans left the Hopi alone. Sometimes they even helped them, as when American troops stopped the Navajo raids on Hopi villages. Later, when the Hopi complained that white settlers had moved onto their land, President Chester A. Arthur created a Hopi reservation. A reservation is land that the U.S. government sets aside for Indian tribes to use. The reservation did keep out the white settlers, but the Hopi lost all their ancestral land that was outside the reservation, and they had to share the reservation with the Navajo. Worst of all, the government at the time thought all Indians were uncivilized. It wanted to make the Hopi stop living like Hopi and start living like white Americans. Why didn't the Hopi want to send their children to government schools? When the U.S. government built the first Hopi schools in the late 1800s, it wanted to teach Hopi children to act like white Americans. Some of the schools were built so far away that children couldn't go home after classes. They had to live at these boarding schools. The government set up boarding schools because it thought if you were away from home, your family couldn't teach you Indian ways. Many Hopi refused to send their children to these schools. Some tried to hide their children from when the troops came looking for them. If a child was found, the troops took him or her away and put the child's father in jail. The Hopi were very upset about the government schools. They wanted their children to live at home. Some parents did want their children to learn English and new skills, but nobody wanted schools that tried to destroy the Hopi culture. How were children treated at the Indian boarding schools? Indian boarding schools were very strict. They thought it was their duty to get rid of your Indian ways, no matter what tribe you came from. Only English was allowed. If they caught you speaking in your own language, you were punished, maybe even whipped. Your clothes were taken from you when you arrived. You were given American-style clothes and an American-style haircut. You were forbidden to practice your own religion, and you were forced to go to church. You were called by an American name instead of your own name. Because the boarding schools were so far away, you couldn't see your family very often. Some children were kept at the boarding school for a very long time. So long, in fact, that they did forget some of their own ways. One girl who returned home for a visit refused to wear the Hopi clothes her brother had woven for her. She no longer felt at ease with her own family. This was a sad time for everyone. Do the Hopi live differently today? For many years, the United States government wanted to change the Hopi way of life. It tried to keep the Hopi from practicing their religion. It tried to force them to give up their ancient way of owning land. It made Hopi parents send their children away to school, and it wouldn't let the Hopi govern themselves. But under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the government began to change. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed. The new law said that the government should help protect Indian traditions, not try to destroy them. It also said that the Indians had a right to their own land and to more self-government. The law did not solve all the problems between the Hopi and the government. It was just the beginning. But today, more than 60 years later, Hopi children can go to nearby schools that teach pride in their Hopi heritage, as well as modern skills. The Hopi no longer live the way their ancestors did. Many work outside the reservation. Some men don't farm anymore, and the Hopi don't have to make everything themselves, because they can go to stores to buy what they need. They continue to make their beautiful pottery and jewelry and baskets, but they also have cars and TVs and videos, just as other Americans do, and many live in modern houses. The Hopi still honor their ancient traditions. Clans are strong. If you were to visit a Hopi village today, you might hear the ancient songs and see the ancient dances, and the Hopi still teach their children how important it is to try and live in peace and cooperation. The Hopi way.